Hello everybody, welcome to this webinar which is part of a series that we've called Steel with Pride, Learning Lessons for Success in Catastrophic Incident Prevention. Today's webinar is going to look at performance reporting and analysis for process safety management. We're going to talk about making sure that leaders know whether things are going right. So the agenda for today is starting with a brief introduction from me. I'm going to talk a little bit about process safety information in a large organisation after that, and then we'll have a panel discussion. As we go through, there is an opportunity for you to log questions the panel might be able to get to at the end. In general terms, I'm going to try and gather those questions up, so I may not ask your question directly, but I'll try and organise questions that look similar to each other. We've got panelists covering utilities, nuclear sector, chemical industry and construction. So, introduction to me, my name is Richard Roff, I'm Process Safety Director for the Costain Group. What I want to talk about is really just a brief introduction to the subject of reporting and analysis, and in order to do that I'm just going to use a case study that many of you will be clear of. In other sessions, other webinars in this series, we've talked about a number of subjects. We've talked about leadership in process safety, we've talked about the need for clear procedures, guidance and training. We've talked about assessing compliance, so the need for assurance audit, and we've talked about investigating unexpected events. Today's session sits, I guess, in a series after that about understanding performance, and in a future session we're going to look at managing change. You may recognise the photograph on the right side of this slide, which is from the Texas City refinery explosion in 2005. Just briefly regarding that incident, it's worth understanding the incident. If you're not familiar with it, there's plenty of information online about what it was and why it happened. But in essence, this was a refinery unit. Distillation column was overfilled and flammable material was released, which led to a vapor cloud explosion. 15 people were killed and 180 were injured. So a very significant incident back in 2005. The plant was starting up after maintenance. There'd been a maintenance turnaround, so the plant was in startup mode. It's worth noting that there was overriding of certain control systems, some of those which were done routinely, as in whenever the plant was started up, and some of them necessary and some of them not, but in essence, overriding of control systems. Instruments were giving misleading information to the operating team, and indeed in the control room, the control panels were not really very well organised, such that it was quite difficult to interpret data that was coming into the control room. At the same time as that, the control room operator was managing several units at once, including this unit in startup, and the need for managing several units at once as a result of numbers reductions over the years. Now, one can argue whether numbers reductions are directly causal in this instance, but the ability to manage and monitor several units at once may impair people's capability of discerning that there's something going wrong. Supervisors in this instance were unable to do a face-to-face handover between shifts, so certain vital information about the state of the plant, the status and how long things have been happening was not passed over. Indeed, some of it was recorded in handover logs, but whilst there was jargon in those logs, jargon sometimes helps us, sometimes it can lead to misunderstandings. So too little information in the handover logs. So those items, those bullets that you see on the slide relate to what might be causal for the incident to occur. The final bullet about contractors being located near to the plant, it relates to how bad the event was. So the contractor teams have been involved in the turnaround, and were still to some extent involved in the turnaround, were located in essence within the blast zone, and therefore the consequences of loss of containment and a fire and explosion were significant as a result of that. So, as I say, that's a very, very simple overview of that incident. I don't plan to unpick that incident in detail, but on this slide you see three questions. What can go wrong, what must go right, and how will we know? And these are three questions that the next speaker, Richard Hellbrand, will return to in his part of the presentation. But it really is important to think not just about the first two, but the third one as well. How will we know? And that's why I've highlighted it. So it is vital that leaders and managers in organisations that have catastrophic incident potential see, discuss and interpret some kind of performance indicators that tell them how things are going. So those indicators should take a view over a number of areas, but it is wise if those indicators focus on the barriers that you have in place to prevent incidents occurring. It's better if the combination of those events can give you advance warning, some degradation. So that doesn't mean that all need to be leading indicators, but leading indicators are helpful when we're talking about advance warning. Those indicators need to allow for weak signals to be identified, and particularly the analysis around those indicators needs to allow for a discussion in weak signals, by which I mean minor things that are going wrong might indicate deeper problems, and it is important that the discussion of those deeper problems follows from the discussion of the minor issues. And finally, if we set our performance indicators and our analysis and our discussion of those up well, then we have time to react. Hopefully the management teams have time and leadership teams have time to react before such incidents occur. Data needs to become information, and it really is important that data becomes information. So sometimes there's potentially a need for analysis on behalf of leaders, so that leaders can gather information from what they're seeing rather than just bald numbers. Some of you may well be aware that the event that I've just talked about in Texas City led to the Baker panel chaired by James Baker III, and it made a number of recommendations. And it's worth picking a couple out of that report, because recommendation 7 talked about leading and lagging performance indicators for process safety. Recommendation 8 talked about process safety auditing, but recommendation 9 also talked about board oversight. So when I talk about leaders, I do mean right up to the top of the business, and not just local leaders and local area managers. So if we thought about what you might want for a refinery module, then we might consider the following sorts of things. And this is a very short list that I put together in terms of thinking about what one might want to measure and might want to consider. It's by no means a long list, it's by no means exhaustive, and we could probably have a conversation over whether each one of them is right. But some ideas. Maybe there's a need to look at whether operators, technicians, managers are trained, competent, maybe some definition of competence. Maybe we need to look at things like overtime and vacancies. Maybe the task of handing over information at the end of shifts should have some kind of quality measure associated with an audit of it, because it's a vital task. Maybe general audits in the business we should look at from the basis of are we doing them, are we delivering them on time and full. Following that, clearly findings. Lots of businesses have the issue of recommendations coming from all quarters, incident and audit. Are we closing them out? Are we understanding those? We may then get into things like instrument calibration, routine maintenance, leader tours, and observation near miss reporting. So some summary of that kind of information would, I think, give leaders at least an overview of how things are going. But it is worth asking the question whether we should, in fact, all audit the same thing. And this may come back in the panel discussion. If we think about every section within a site, every within a business, and every business within some international or national group, it may well be that the sections have different kinds of technology. So there are things that are specific to the section. So some of the performance indicators for process safety on a section will be different from section. Likewise, in a site, it may well be that we want to think about, well, what are we looking at this site? Have I got an organization that manages this site, and so on? So I guess what I want to transmit with this image is I don't think necessarily forcing the same indicator into every section, every site, and every business in any group is helpful, but there are some that will be common to all areas. So for me, the important part is to have process safety indicators and make sure that they cover information around how the barriers are working. Okay, so I've got a comment about numbers reduction and a comment about talking directly to operators, both well made. They would equally form potential indicators. I also have a comment on audio, which if it is at my end, I do apologise, but I do live in the countryside and the broadband I have is what I have, unfortunately. So, okay, I'm going to stop at this point and hand you over to Richard Hellebrand, who will introduce himself, but he's got a more general presentation about not just performance indicators, but other types of information that should flow around an organisation for good process safety management.
Thanks, Richard.
So, over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Hopefully you can all hear me, my audio okay. I'm sure it'll come up in the questions if there's a problem. As usual, the slides go too fast. So, for those that don't know me, I work as an engineer in a multinational chemical manufacturer called Westlake Chemicals. We've around 16,000 employees around the world and about $14 billion turnover. Before that, I worked in many other companies, so I've got fairly lengthy experience. And my presentation is really a summary of some of that experience. It's not just Westlake. I'm trying to target sort of newbies to experts, if you like, and apologies if I'm teaching the experts to suck eggs here. But if you're daunted how to measure and improve your organization's process safety, don't panic. There is a lot of useful information available and getting hold of it is straightforward. So I'm going to try and guide you to some free resources that will help. And you can maybe use those to get continuous improvement. If you look in the overview section on the workcast, there are 25 links at the bottom, and they're all referenced within the following slides. So click on them and bookmark them. If you already know, great. If you don't know them, then hopefully you've learned something. Okay, well, Richard talked about sort of previous disasters, but they happen every year. Even last year, there was a disaster near Leverkusen. It's opposite Cologne, next to the Rhine. And what happened? It's a incineration plant that takes in waste materials from around Europe, about 240,000 tons a year, I think. And what they did, and they were storing waste materials in a small tank, about a 50 cubic meter tank. It was only a quarter full though. And on the left, I can't use a laser pointer on this, but you've got three big tanks in a line, and if you sort of just go to the right of the top big tank, there's a small tank there. If you then go to the photo on the right, that tank no longer exists because it blew up. And you can see what the pressure wave did to the pipe track. There was a domino as well to all the other tanks. And the tank that blew up had phosphorus-based wastes and some dimethyl ester. All the surrounding tanks had various solvents, all waiting for incineration. And what happened is the waste that was delivered was declared as the wrong waste. And a lot of waste materials have a thing called an SADT, self-accelerating decomposition temperature. If you store it below, you're fine. If you store it above it, it will run away. And that's exactly what happened. It ran away, it lifted a relief valve. The relief valve wasn't designed for that, so it couldn't cope, and then the tank blew up and it killed 7 people, injured 31 people. So it's not something about in the past we're talking about. This stuff still happens. All right, a little bit back to basics. So what's process safety management? Shortened to call it PSM. It's the management of technology and people to prevent catastrophic events. So we're not worried about slips, trips and falls and this. We're talking about the things that kill people, a lot of people. And they're usually caused by an uncontrolled release, toxics, flammables, or even just pressure. We term that loss of containment. So the trick to good PSM is to minimize loss of containment throughout the whole life cycle of the plants, right the way from the left of that diagram. Someone comes up with a concept for a new process, they build it, commission it, start it up, and then you get into a long cycle of operating the plant. Could be 10 years, 20 years, could be 50 years, with modifications, maintenance, and then shutdowns, and eventually it will be decommissioned. So this is a bit messy, but it's not my chart, it's one from Ian Travers, but I think it's really good because it describes really what PSM's about, and you can use it, and I've used it for PSM policy at work, and also just as an auditing tool because it shows the interaction of where all these things are, how important they are. So very briefly, we start off at the top with hazard identification. We're going to use some particular chemicals or nuclear materials or whatever it is that's dangerous. We do the risk assessments. There could be HAZOP, there could be FMEA, there could be all sorts of things. And from that, we finalise the plant and process design, the basis of safety. We can fix how we're going to operate it. We can fix our procedures, our controls. Hopefully how we start up and shut down as well, not just how we run it in the middle. And from that, we get, what our assets are, what the ranges are. So we have asset integrity, maintenance, and to do the maintenance, to do the operation, we have to have competence and training. We have to manage contractors. We have permits to work. We have management of change for when the plant gets modified, and if it all really goes badly wrong, we have emergency arrangements. But 2 really, really important things on the left and on the right. The leadership culture. Richard's been banging on about this for the last few webinars, and he's absolutely right too, because unless we get them engaged, you can't drive the rest. And then the subject of this webinar really is the right-hand side. How do we monitor, measure and review that all this stuff is working? Okay, back to the 3 questions again. Number 1, what could go wrong? And that's an easy question to ask. It can be quite a difficult question to answer. You have to do it right, do the risk assessment right. Cursory risk assessments will give us a full sense of security. And then, knowing what can go wrong, what barriers do we need to ensure nothing goes wrong? And, all right, identifying the barriers, how would we know they're working? And if we can get those, to answer those 3 simple questions, we need quite a lot of up-to-date information. But the information is specific to, the company. Here's an example of some barriers, and I've split them into prevention and mitigation. What we're trying to avoid is the bit on the right: deaths, high costs, reputational damage, jobs lost. And whenever we handle hazardous processes, then there's the potential for that to happen. So I'm taking the example of an exothermic reaction in a batch reactor or a pressurized autoclave. And what we're trying to avoid in the yellow box really is a runaway reaction. And to do that, the barriers start off with, well, process design. Have we designed it properly? HAZOPs or equivalent. Have we done the risk assessment right? Have we trained people? Is our DCS or other process control systems, is it programmed properly? And when we, as a designer, it's important to get verification. Have you just got one person doing all these things? You need someone else to check it. And then we go in, well, we have to maintain that vessel and all those controls. We have people doing pressure vessel examinations, pipe work, etc. We have a process alarms. Now, Murat, I've just got a message that says no sound. I'm hoping everybody else can hear me. Okay, well, I'm going to carry on. And beyond process alarms, independent safety instrumented systems to trip. So if the operator's distracted, hopefully the safety instrumented systems will work fine. And then if those don't work, usually have a pressure relief valve to vent that exotherm, that pressure, that loss of containment to a safe area. If it still happens and we still get a problem, then the mitigation barriers are about emergency plans and recovery plans. And the important bit of all of this is that if you look at the blue ones, they're human barriers. And how often do we make mistakes? It's easy to make mistakes. So human barriers are something we need to concentrate on. Okay, I'm not going to read through all this list. I think if you haven't already done it and you start to go through what you have available, you probably have most of this stuff. If you've ever had audits, you've probably had to dig this out and talk to people about it. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's 2 or 3 things I will highlight. I think management of change is one of the big ones because depending on where you go, people can be a bit malleable about what they think of management of change. Some people view it as essential and a really good thing to do. Other people view it as bureaucracy and taking time, and they don't like to do it. And it's got to be done right. Even the simplest of modifications could end up in a disaster. And then the last one the last bullet point I'm going to highlight again, key performance indicators. Now this sort of pyramids from American Petroleum Institute's recommended practice 754. We don't have to report tier 1 to tier 4 in the UK or in Europe, but nevertheless it does illustrate that what we're trying to avoid is those tier 1 events at the top. LOPC, that means loss of primary containment, events of greater consequence. And even underneath that, for every really big disaster like the Currenta one at Leverkusen, then you'll have maybe smaller ones that don't quite end up in that situation. But and if you measure those and track those, then they're very much lagging indicators because something's already happened. Okay, it's more important really to have leading indicators, and I really, in my opinion, these tier 3, tier 4 ones are the important ones because these are measuring how our barriers are performing. Challenges to safety systems, operating discipline, management system, and even the KPIs. If you want to know more about this, there are 3 references. I've put them in the overview. IMechE guidance. In the UK, if you're a coma operator, there's HSG 254. And if you're in a wider European context, CEFIC is the trade body for the European chemical industry, and they've also provided guidance. And it's, all three of these really align with each other and are doing the same things. All right, again, a long list of KPIs. You can pick your own. There are lots more than this. I'm not going through them all, but again, I like to concentrate on the ones at the top. Things like measuring whether your audits are being completed to plan. If you've been, bearing in mind people are what tend to go wrong rather than equipment. If we list all our tasks and then define which ones are really safety critical, maybe do a 4 eyes approach on those procedures, and then get some task observations through the year. Watch how they're done. It trains the people watching, it trains the people doing, it keeps the procedures up to date. And these are the important things. And then there's a whole bunch of other possibilities, and there are more than that. At a local level, right at the bottom, he says, no, yeah. Plants and units, processes need their own very, very specific KPIs. They might not be corporate, but they're actually probably more important at the local level. All right, so, and then implementing best practice. We don't need to make any of this up. It's all available online and generally fairly free to look at. So, again, these are referenced, you can click on the references afterwards and find this stuff, but lots of bodies produce best practice information, and that can be fed in and used to structure your management system if you haven't already done that. And some of the outputs from that, in my case, into the corporate management system, we've got ISO 45001 audits, policies, guidelines, operating instructions, blah, 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 blah. So there's lots of ways to use that best practice. Also, communications, and it depends upon what you want to communicate and who to. It should never all just be electronic. Face-to-face is great, but emails and meetings are possible. And then also some of that best practice can be posted in whatever corporate intranet you have. I'll show a couple of examples of that as I move on. All right. So I highly recommend these 3 documents. The first one on the left is really targeted at executive boards and senior leaders, but it can put the wind up them, and it includes a nice self-assessment questionnaire. The one on the right from the Energy Institute is full-on management system. There are 20 modules. I say management system, it's more about expectations, but that also includes questions, and you can use that to do a gap analysis. And I've done that for my organisation. The one in the middle is really, really practical, process safety fundamentals. And what that is the European Process Safety Centre analysed about 900 process safety events 2019. And they got the causal factors, and most were due to people, either design, operations, and maintenance. And they produced, I think, how many? 15 process safety fundamentals, things like double isolation, burners, leak tightness, plugged equipment, line of fire, splash loading, lots of really good resources that you can use. So we've talked a little bit about KPIs, a bit about best practice, but then, you know, the whole purpose of this series of webinars is learning from incidents. And there's lots of information we can get. Internally, depending on how big we are, we might have our own process safety incidents, root cause analysis, hopefully. EPSC learning sheets every month, they produce one. The same for the the process safety beacons every month from the US, very similar documents. Really good, ideal to be used in many contexts. But then the CSB and the Energy Institute Toolbox, etc., also have their own databases and evidence. And what we can do is share them. There's so much information, it would be like drowning people with a fire hose. And really, we need to drip that information to the right places to make it relevant to people. So in my case, depending on what it is, I share it in different places. So the tricks, in my opinion anyway, split the learning up, direct it to relevant people. Telling people too often about disasters sounds like Peter crying wolf all the time. It's got to be relevant. If possible, include photos, videos or animations to make it memorable. I haven't done it today because of the bandwidth issues. And also encourage managers and engineers to cascade that learning and check for relevance. I find the learning sheets, the safety beacons, the CSB videos and the EI Toolbox make excellent short safety moments or toolbox talks. So just in case you've never seen them, this is an example of a learning sheet from EPSC and a safety beacon from CCPS. Very similar format. They pick up on topics every month and they're in multiple language. So if you're multinational, you can get the language you need. Just this morning before this, I was uploading the latest September ones to our intranet in English and in German. And I've already got a Toolbox talk this afternoon using an EPSC data sheet. So they're good. And then my final slide, a plug for the Energy Institute Toolbox. The Energy Institute, for much of its history, was mainly the Institute of Petroleum, so they've got a long background in process safety, particularly in the North Sea, offshore, but nowadays more and more the transition to renewables. It's a completely free resource on web page or on phone apps. Lots of good examples in there. It's growing every day, and again they're trying to add additional languages. So a bit of a plug for the Energy Institute. So that's my last slide. I've just tried to share lots of resources really. If anybody's got any questions that they can't do on the chat, my email address is on the front, or at least my IMechE one is. Send me an email and I'll try and help you out. Richard, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Okay, so there are a couple of questions that I might gather up that have come in during the time I've been speaking and Richard's been speaking. I see a couple more. I've got some starter questions to get the panel moving, but please, if you have any thoughts or any questions that you'd like the panel to discuss, then now's a good time. Okay, so just to be clear, I have a couple of other panel members. Richard, who's just spoken, will be on. We also have Stephen McAvoy and Mark Backler. Just give me a moment. I'll make sure. So Stephen works for Sellafield Limited, it's in the nuclear sector, so fuel reprocessing. Mark Backler works for United Utilities, which in the northwest of England is water and wastewater utility supplier. Richard told you where he works already, and so have I. So in order that you can just about see what we all look like, here you go. So I'm going to come to Stephen first. So Stephen, can you just start by telling us a bit more about the industry you work in and you know, what's the life cycle stage and how does it work?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So I currently work in the encapsulation plant at Sellafield. So that's the sort of back end of the intermediate level waste stream, sort of interim storage for the next 50-ish years. So that's currently in the sort of plant life cycle arena. A lot of the site, the sort of broader site, is more on the decommissioning side. So the area I'm in at the moment, I've got a lot of sort of heavy mechanical equipment, sort of 30, 40 years old, and there's a lot of management of change as we bring in new missions and new waste streams and things, and that's sort of the main exposure I have to process safety at the moment is that management.
Okay, so with that in mind, what sort of measures are you tracking to sort of follow what we've been talking about, which is the prevention of catastrophic risks? Fair to say the obvious hazard is radioactive material, and it getting out of control is clearly something you want to prevent. So, but what is it you're looking at, and what are you assessing and measuring?
Yeah, so obviously that sort of radiological safety is a huge thing, but also we have a lot of conventional safety hazards as well, as you'd expect. And I think not that they've sort of been sidelined, but they're often not the sort of main focus. So we look at across the site. There's trending of those low-level events. So somebody maybe gets contamination on some of their PPE and so on. So that the culture on the site is good in such a way that all of those low-level events get sentenced, and they go up to the top management exec level on a weekly basis, and really is looking at those trends, those low-level ones, and trying to figure out where the next big one's going to be, and mitigating or ideally preventing that.
Okay, thank you. So you're sort of trying to take a proxy based on the things that you can measure and can see, as well as looking at things that have gone out of control.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. I'll shift focus to another of our panelists, Mark. So if I come to you, can you first tell us a little bit about what you do in United Utilities, what United Utilities hazards are, and then talk perhaps after that about the indicators that are going on in your business?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Richard. So United Utilities, if anyone lives in the northwest of England, should be familiar with our services. We look after water and wastewater for the entirety of the northwest. So as you can imagine, we've got a very large asset base, probably, well, I was going to say millions, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of assets. Typically, they're non-hazardous, which has maybe historically led us down a route of not being on top of process safety hazards as we could be. Having said that, we do have a number of process sites that have large quantities of hazardous materials on, and two of the biggest we have is something called biogas, which is predominantly methane, and we also have a lot of chlorine. Our actual activities cover the whole asset lifecycle, particularly from an engineering standpoint. We would get involved in designing, building, scoping out solutions, sites, processes, etc., all the way through operate and maintain, all the way to decommissioning, etc. I personally am the technical authority for biogas, so me and my team get involved in all sorts. We act as subject matter experts, we help with the operational teams, we define the standards that things have to be built to, etc. In terms of process safety, there's obviously quite a clear link there. About probably 5 years ago, we started to focus a bit more on maybe not reacting. We were maybe biased towards these lagging indicators, so reliant on incidents or people flagging up stuff that had maybe already happened through our corporate systems, and we started moving towards managing process safety a little bit better, and we now have a dedicated process safety team. They have what they call process safety performance indicators, which are essentially the KPIs that have been mentioned previously. And we use those as sort of the check function, looking at the health of our key safeguards and the control barriers in place, and trying to shift that bias away from the reactive, the lagging indicators, towards the leading ones. So looking at the quality of our management systems, looking at the audits, looking at inspections that have been completed, that sort of thing. We, of course, still react to the lagging indicators as well, but we've tried to make that balance a bit more even.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So just to come back to Richard, a couple of the comments or a couple of questions that have come in talk about the need to discuss or at least assess KPIs in a management review process. And to some extent, that's what I was also referring to in my process. The idea of a regular drumbeat of discussion of KPIs is important. And how does that work from your perspective, Richard?
Right. Well, we collect our KPIs monthly. Do a quarterly business report, which will go to directors and VPs and people like that. But each month, once I've got the KPIs, I send out a targeted emails to unit managers, unit engineers, the people at the sharp end, if you like, with some trends. So numbers on their own are not a lot of use. I tend to use a traffic light system. So something's drifting, maybe I'll maybe put an amber colour on it. If it's red, so there's been an incident or a near miss, I'll use red. But try and highlight things because people are really busy. So it's really important, whatever you send out, to give the sort of short summary précis of what to look at. And then follow it up as well, particularly with relevance checks.
So do you get an opportunity to follow up in some sort of routine discussion where this is on the agenda and there's no choice to discuss it?
Yeah, it depends what level you're at, but at the individual plant level, they have the daily routines. Anything that's coming through electronically or on the plant is discussed at sort of toolbox talk level and at the initial management meeting Monday to Friday. Then they have monthly safety routines. So again, the stuff I send out and others send out as well will be discussed. We have quarterly business review, but we also have quarterly operations and safety and environment reviews. And it was interesting because PSM used to be the last agenda item. Nowadays, it's the second or third at the beginning because people have recognised that actually that's what they want. That's what they need to talk about, not so much about how many people have sprained their fingers or their backs.
Indeed. So my experience is that these things at first have to be forced onto the agenda, but eventually, as the leadership team understands why they're being talked about, then they tend to recognise how important they are. So yeah, I think it's an important point that just a one-way push of information is only part of the picture. We actually do need leaders and managers to go, hey, tell me how things are going, because otherwise the third question that both you and I referred to is unanswered. Okay, so just in a different field, the idea of sort of understanding how competent your leadership are in order to engage with this kind of information how is that done? I'll come back to you, Richard, first. In your experience, how have you sort of had a step back and have a look at the leaders in your business and go, do they understand what it is I'm telling them here, or we are telling them here?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you can't go and challenge someone who's been doing a job for 20 or 30 years to say, are you competent? But I actually recall about 10 years ago, actually, when I had a coma audit in the UK and the HSE inspector turned up. And his first question was, why are you all competent as leaders? How? I want to see your degree certificates, your professional qualifications and some CPD. So he went right in and challenged immediately. And it's something you can do, but I think people are embarrassed sometimes to admit at whatever level they're at, whether they lack something. And the more senior you get, the more embarrassed they are and less likely to ask for help. So what I find is if you set the standards and agree them, like the policy, and that dictates levels of competence, if you like, then people can then say, oh, maybe I'm going to need some training on this, but they're not admitting that they're not competent. In practice, I find most managers and engineers very good. And I deal with a lot of Germans, and they're mainly PhDs and master's degrees. They're all very good. So it's
Yeah.
not.
So this, apologies. This relates to the idea of kind of corporate unease, and actually a properly mindful organisation in process safety terms would not be embarrassed to say, I don't know that. Even at the most senior levels would be saying, actually, tell me more. I want to understand more. So, but chronic unease is very difficult to measure, and one of the commenters has suggested that, and I tend to agree. It's more a step back and do we think we're asking ourselves the tough questions often enough? Okay, so there's another comment and I'm going to come back to you at the moment, Richard, just with regard to both corporate knowledge and the idea of passing information out for the organisation to read and inwardly digest. How do you know that the busy people who are receiving your bulletins and beacons and emails are doing the right thing with it?
Again, it's a sort of quite a varied structure and quite extensive, many different sites. It's impossible to know for certain. However, I think it's about feedback. So I was talking about PSM being at the bottom of the agenda. It's actually these people that ask for it to be put towards the top of the agenda. So they want to know this stuff. People don't like, they don't want to be, fire hosed with information, but they do want knowledge. And that's the trick here is to differentiate from data. From data we get information, from information hopefully we get knowledge, and then maybe we end up with some wisdom at the end of it. So we're trying to help people to do their job. It's not about an HSE department or a PSM engineer or someone telling people what to do. It's helping them all the time to try and perform a bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have in previous webinars discussed the idea of, is it the day job? I think it's the day job of all professional engineers, if they're professional, to keep looking for information and absorbing it from all sorts of fields. And, so if somebody in your own company is sending you it, that should be relatively high up the priority list. Okay, thanks for that, Richard. I'm going to come back to Mark. I had a question regarding reservoirs, and of course, reservoirs are a potential catastrophic incident. Collapse of reservoir is a known thing, and indeed in recent years it's known for tailing reservoirs, in particular in the mining sector. So is that come under your remit, Mark, and is it something that you consider in terms of its process safety management?
So to answer the first part of the question, no, it doesn't. So I can give a little bit of detail. We do have a reservoir safety group, and it is something that we are right on top of in terms of measuring performance indicators. I wouldn't be able to talk to what those are, though, unfortunately.
That's okay. I mean, so in some respects, the potential for reservoirs to fail has been known about for hundreds of years, and therefore reservoir safety as a separate topic is kind of understood in a sort of civil engineering and particularly water sense. But it is an area that the company is focused on, is what you're confirming.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a dedicated group looking at it.
Okay, great. In thinking about, we can measure things that happen, count things that happen or don't happen, and we can draw those together. But I'm going to come back to Stephen now. Are there any processes at Sellafield whereby we try to gauge the views and the opinions of the people either working in maintenance or in operations? And if so, how do they work?
Yeah, so there are quite a few different tools. One of the more recent ones is a discussion forum that's open to everybody with access to a computer on the site, where people can post anonymously with any sort of concerns or discussion, general sort of feelings and trends across the site. That's a fairly recent thing, and seems to be sort of bringing out quite a lot of stuff that maybe doesn't make it onto condition reports and into trends and sort of that has historically not been reported upwards. I think when we talk about the sort of those human barriers and those multiple barriers to catastrophes, in the nuclear industry at least, that's generally referred to as the Swiss cheese model, because every single one of those slices has holes in it because they're human, obviously human factors involved. So the reason you then put those multiple layers in place is to avoid those holes lining up, so you don't get that one thing that can pass straight through everything and realize that failure.
Right. So just in the piece about the Swiss cheese model, that's the what must go right question, or what do the barriers look like in Richard's terms. I think something that I perceive can fail is if I talk to a group or a person managing one of those barriers, they may say, okay, I don't need to worry too much about my barrier because somebody else's barrier will catch us. It's important to get across the message that the risk isn't low enough without all the barriers in place, isn't it? So are there any aspects of that when you're using the Swiss cheese model, Stephen, that you try to get information across into the field, out beyond the office?
So how do you mean? Sorry. So obviously, I mean, one of the ones that I use is if I'm modifying the plant, I'll have to present a paper to a committee for even fairly sort of minor trivial mods. So that'll go to a committee. So that reduces the chance of somebody who's authoring that paper thinking, well, there are enough other layers that I can sort of pay lip service to this process. So I think each layer, at least in this industry, generally has multiple people involved, and that'll be sort of head of ops, head of maintenance, sort of quite senior people who all have that sort of sense of unease, or at least should.
Right. Okay. So yeah, and I think the point I suppose I'm trying to understand is one of, do we hear from the operators and the mechanics and the electricians how they see the world, and some of the processes to gauge that can be reactive, as in we wait for their observations to come in, or we hope that they record incidents and near misses. We could equally go out and look for evidence that they understand what they did. So Richard talked about viewing how tasks are done and comparing that to what does the procedure say for this task. So yeah, we can think about that as an assurance process, but equally it could be useful to get findings from that assurance and say to managers, hey, the guys aren't doing it the way we wanted them to. It may be because the way we wanted them to was impractical, but equally it may be that we haven't transmitted what we need very carefully from management to the teams. Okay, right, thank you for that. So a question has come in with regard to management of change, and you just referred to this, Stephen. You talked about a process of, in essence, making your pitch for why this is a good modification to make, and the fact that you've thought it through. That's your committee process, I think. In measuring management of change, do you look at just numbers, or do you try to look at quality, or how do you think management of change is looked at at Sellafield?
So I think it's definitely quality. There'll be some metrics regarding numbers where it comes to things like temporary modifications to software and things. The temporary things have a habit of sort of becoming less temporary, if you like, and stacking up.
Yes.
But with the proper management of change, there are time limits set on those, and then that's where the quality comes in with they call the plant modification proposal is the system that Sellafield use, and that sort of goes right back to what happened at Chernobyl. That's what kicked off this process.
Right.
So that has multiple levels of buy-in from sort of engineering manager, maintenance manager, operations manager within the site or within the plant. So people who know that plant well, and then it goes right up to the head of operations has to sign on and be happy that the reason you're doing it is sound, that you're doing it in the right way. So it comes back to a LARP, sort of managing your risk, doing the sort of best option or sometimes the least worst option if you're trying to recover some broken down heavy equipment, which might require sort of robotics, or worst case, giving somebody some sort of managed dose of radiation. So it's definitely a quality metric, not a quantity metric in that sense.
Yeah, okay. And so in further response to that question, your process has built in quality checks, and so making sure we go through all of the hoops of that process allows us to infer some elements of quality from absolute quantity. Okay. We're getting close towards the end of the question, but I've got a left field question, and I will, those of you that haven't had your questions answered, I'll try and summarize them in a second and give you some brief answers. But there's a question about whether climate change is changing the policies of our industries, I guess, with respect to process safety management. And I suppose, recent weather events like floods and so on may well change the nature of the type of incident that we think is credible in a given sector. But since you're in utilities, Mark, and water is your game, what's your view on process safety and whether or not it needs a different view with respect to climate change?
Well, there's actually, rather than water, is probably quite a good example with regards to the biogas systems we have. So predominantly the gas is methane, which of course has been coming out recently, is perhaps more of a contributor to global warming than we first thought. It's massively worse than carbon dioxide, etc. So actually, we're really trying to focus now on controlling emissions of things like methane, and how that links into process safety is actually what we try and do with our biogas systems is prevent overpressure, so we have things like PVRVs that are prone to leakage. We also have to put in place things like flare stacks in order to, if we do have an issue in terms of being able to manage the biogas, we can burn it and turn it into carbon dioxide. So it's very, very relevant, and it's something that the Environment Agency and the HSE are starting to look at more and more closely. So we're working with them in terms of managing our methane emissions to try and prevent that climate impact. But of course, that has then got a direct impact on the process safety of the plant, because if you're mucking around with pressure relief valves and your ability to do something with the gas, well then does that lead to a bigger problem elsewhere? So it's all very closely tied together.
Right, that's really interesting. I thank you for that. And I see it also in the construction world, in the sense that what you don't build embeds no carbon. So, but we have been able to use some of the process safety concepts to bring the measures of carbon reduction, how well are we doing at carbon reduction, to the same sort of audience. We've been talking about leaders and managers and the need to, deliver on a barrier. We can use the same kinds of concepts, but that's a really interesting one, Mark, that once you trap the biogas, you now have to keep it safe, don't you? Historically, decades ago, we just let it all go. Really interesting. Okay, I'm thinking we're sort of close to running out of time, but there are a couple of questions that I wanted to sort of jump through. There was a question when I was talking about Texas City, and the Baker panel did refer to numbers reduction and culture of parent companies as a factor in the process. So there is I think I put a link into the Baker panel report. Certainly you can get a hold of that relatively easy. It's a pretty extensive read, but worth reading certainly if you're in refining and potentially in other sectors too. What I would say is one may be able to reduce the number of operators managing plants that are online and steady, but you have to think about, is a startup a time when we can manage with this many people in the control room, or should we have more? And certainly that issue is learned the hard way, not just in that event, but in numerous other events over the last few decades of actually when we're changing state, when we're changing something, shutdown or startup or recovery, we may need more hands and indeed more brain power around. So, one might be able to reduce the number of operators in general, but still be able to manage a startup if one thinks about it. There's a question about loss of containment causing anoxia-related fatalities. There's an argument as to whether that is a personal safety or a process safety issue, but for me, if it's getting out of the pipe or the tank, we probably ought to think about it in the context of process safety. And if the consequence is we create a space that's not breathable, then that's the consequence that you might see on the right-hand side of a bow tie or a Swiss cheese model. So there's no reason not to talk about it, particularly when we talk about interventions and entries into confined spaces, because isolation processes are quite important there. Okay, another question asked about financial constraints, and it's absolutely the case that financial constraints could lead to the kinds of failures that cause these incidents. But there is a question then about whether a business is viable. So if you want the money to make it safe, then we shouldn't just continue without making it safe. So the difficulty for a lot of businesses to decide, I think, as Richard said, how safe is safe enough, firstly, through studies of risk, but then to say, well, okay, if I can't resource that, I really can't run this operation in this location. And the location might matter because the consequences might be related to the location. So, yes, there are probably a number of incidents that one could look at where cost saving or injudicious cost saving might well be causal. A comment was made about understanding the plant, and when I talked about competence, I don't just mean certificates and training, I mean something wider than that, which would include understanding the plant. So whatever the plant looks like for you, if it's an aero engine, or if it's a facility making chemicals, or a nuclear facility, or a highway or a railway, understanding how it works, it's kind of vital that the people who are intervening on it do understand how it works and why it works that way, because if we don't understand why it works that way, we may well change it in a manner that contributes to degradation. And the final point, I guess, is to when we are passing information out to others in our business, of course, we can ring them up and find out whether they got it, whether they understood it. In our business, we also use sort of communities of practice. So those are people interested in particular subjects, and it tends to be easier to get an understanding of whether the message was received and understood from a community of practice, because you're already talking about people who are interested. Of course, the difficulty one has with that is somebody who hasn't signed up to be in the community of practice but should have is now an even more difficult person to get to. But there are swings and roundabouts with all of those. Okay, so look, thank you all for your questions. I hope you've enjoyed what you've heard. An hour flies by in this instance. Check out some of the links and the resources that Richard and I have put together. And particularly if you're dealing with leaders, check out the OECD and a couple of other pieces of information that's there, because sometimes hearing from the Institute of Directors gives a warm feeling to directors, and they're not hearing it from some underling like we are. So, okay, that can be helpful. For future events, we do plan to look at change management in a little bit more detail. What sorts of changes should we be managing for process safety management and catastrophic incident prevention? What good practices are there, and maybe to share some of those and hopefully get your questions on that. Before I close though, this final slide, if you need Cpd certificates, you can email murat.islam@member.imeche.org, and there's a feedback form. We do appreciate your feedback, so if you have a moment to fill in a feedback form, there is a link here. I'm hoping that Fiona's been able to put those into the links as well. So thank you all for your time. Have a good rest of the day, or beginning of the day, depending on where you are in the world. And we shall see you again in the future. Thank you very much.